Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you and your loved ones are doing okay during this really challenging time for us all. My name is Susie Gelman. I'm privileged to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. If you are new to Israel Policy Forum, I want to welcome you. Israel Policy Forum is committed to educating policymakers and community leaders and building support for advancing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states in order to ensure Israel's security and its well-being as a Jewish and a democratic state. If you are not already receiving our updates and analysis by email, I hope that you will take this opportunity to sign up. Of course, today we are in an unprecedented global health crisis. And yet, we at Israel Policy Forum are committed to continuing our work to serve as a credible resource for analysis to understand the dynamics in the region and ideas for how we may move forward to a more sustainable, secure, and peaceful future. Today's call will be the first of several weekly webinars that will be open to the public and hosted by Israel Policy Forum. Each Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we will speak with leading experts on the situation in the region on a range of topics, including, of course, how this health crisis is shaping the political and security landscape in Israel and the wider region. So I hope you'll mark your calendars and join us in the weeks ahead. I also want to encourage you all to listen to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, which is now recording 2 episodes per week on the latest political developments in Israel. Our last episode, which was recorded late last week, features a discussion with Israel's former Deputy Attorney General Joshua Schaufman. Of course, in Israel today, in addition to dealing with the unprecedented coronavirus health crisis, the country is also facing an unprecedented political crisis. The intersection between these crises will be the subject of our discussion today with our good friend, Neri Zilber. Neri is an Israeli journalist who is a regular contributor to the Daily Beast and many other leading publications. He is the research director of BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Center. He is also an adjunct fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and as I mentioned, a good friend of Israel Policy Forum. Neri has been a frequent guest on our podcast, and we are truly grateful to have him join us for today's webinar discussion. Neri, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to now have Q&A, so let me give you instructions how you can ask a question. If you are on this webinar through the Zoom app, you'll note a tab for Q&A. You just click it and type in your question and hit submit. And we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. If you're on a phone, the best way to ask a question is to email your question to info@israelpolicyforum.org. Again, that's info@israelpolicyforum.org. One final thing, and I will kick it off while you guys are typing in questions. There have apparently been some internet issues in Israel in terms of connectivity, I guess because everybody is distance learning and everything else, right? And using the internet over time. So if for some reason Neri does get cut off temporarily, he'll dial back in. So just please be patient if that does happen. And with that, I'm going to start by asking Neri to please describe the situation in Israel, maybe just starting off with the corona situation.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Susie and IPF for having me on again. I'm honored to be the first of hopefully not too many web series, distance learning through IPF, but it might be a while. But thank you for the invitation, and for everybody who is called in and watching right now, thoughts and prayers to you and your loved ones during what is a very unorthodox time globally in terms of the coronavirus, and what we'll get into later on is the unorthodox time period right now in Israel politically, and how the corona crisis and the political crisis here are kind of melding over the past week or two. But just in terms of your first question, Susie, just the coronavirus crisis and the situation here in Israel, some people probably know this, the country is on the verge of total lockdown. It's not quite there yet. The Netanyahu government, the cabinet, is deciding on further measures this evening. They might further restrict the movement of people. But as of now, you can still go out to do essential things like buy groceries, pharmacies. People are still out working out outside, doing sporting activity. But it's a lot quieter, and again, almost on the verge of a shutdown, like many other places in the world. I should say that Israel and the Netanyahu government in particular saw this coming ahead of many. At the beginning of March, they started quarantining returnees from Asia. That expanded to several hotspots in Europe. Just people coming back into the country, they were sent into 14-day mandatory quarantines. That expanded later on to kind of shutting down sporting activities and large gatherings. And then further on, they shut down the schools and the kindergartens, all of this well known pretty much around the world at the moment. But Israel, to their credit, was a bit earlier than most. And now, as of now, obviously the border crossings are closed, very limited, if non-existent air travel. Pretty much Israelis are hunkering down. It's nothing all that new for Israel in terms of prior decades of experience with this is something new. And Israelis, for the time being, are handling it relatively well. But I should say that because there isn't a total lockdown just yet, and there isn't, I should add, any police or border police or army units on the streets just yet, although that might be coming fairly soon. There are certain segments of the population who perhaps aren't taking it as seriously, and there's a major concern that there could be outbreaks, for instance, in ultra-Orthodox towns and neighborhoods, perhaps Arab Israeli towns and villages. Also, I should say, I'm speaking to you from Tel Aviv at the moment. A lot of young Tel Avivis who perhaps aren't taking things as seriously as they should. And I think all of that combined is perhaps pushing the government to further restrict movement and to make it mandatory and enforceable. And that might be coming as early as this evening. Just in terms of numbers, there are about 1,600 infected. We've had about 3 deaths so far, but obviously the numbers are expected to rise. And overall, it's you know, Israelis are watching this with utmost concern. People aren't working. There's already about 16, perhaps 17% unemployment. It was just 4% a few weeks ago, record lows to record highs. And that's about 600,000 Israelis who are now taking out unemployment benefits from the government. And that's also expected to rise. And then finally, of utmost concern to the authorities here and to me personally is how well the Palestinian territories do in containing the virus. So the West Bank itself is on complete lockdown. The restrictions there are even greater than what you have in Israel. Also in the Gaza Strip, the Hamas authorities have begun shutting down mosques, schools. There's, it's also on the path to further lockdown. And there are a few dozen cases in the West Bank that are, I believe, contained at the moment. There are 2 cases in the Gaza Strip as of now. That's also, I believe, contained. But it's an area of great concern because, unlike Israel and other Western states, the medical system in the West Bank and Gaza is nothing like what it should be. And so, if there is a major outbreak, then Israel, as it has been doing for the weeks now, will perhaps have to come in and assist both the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and even the Hamas authorities in the Gaza Strip with containing the outbreak. So writ large, that's the coronavirus situation, and nobody's expecting a quick resolution, but they keep talking about after Passover, after the holidays, which is a common refrain in Israel.
Always.
We'll take care of it after the holidays. Right now, this is kind of a light in a very dark tunnel for the population here. I don't think anybody can say with 100% certainty that Israel will have it contained and will be getting back to normal by the middle or end of April.
On Gaza, by the way, I think I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's one ventilator for 1.5 million residents. Am I making that up? I saw something really just draconian in terms of how poorly supplied Gaza is if there is an outbreak. Okay. In any event, let's move on to the political, and I actually want to take Neri. A couple of people have asked questions. They're similar, so I'll throw them both at you. From Dan Arbel, who I think you know well. Neri, from a legal standpoint, what happens if Edelstein does not abide by the Supreme Court's ruling and does not allow a vote for speaker? And similarly, Gary Gilbert is asking, could you please explain the political and constitutional issues surrounding the controversy regarding the election of Speaker of the Knesset and the response by the current Speaker, Yuli Edelstein?
Okay, so moving from the pandemic to the political crisis. Right, so the questions are in relation to what we've seen in the past 2 days. The Speaker of the Knesset from the governing Likud party is essentially almost refusing to abide by a Supreme Court ruling that he has to convene the Knesset and allow the Knesset to vote on a new speaker. So the constitutional and legal issues relating to this are very clear, to be frank. The Attorney General, the government's own legal counsel, essentially here in Israel, according to the system, couldn't defend the Speaker Edelstein's position, couldn't defend the government's position. He urged the Knesset to reconvene, and it was sworn in last week before the Speaker shut down proceedings. The Supreme Court, in a ruling late last night, was very clear that Edelstein had Knesset and to allow this vote to take place. And then pretty much every, let's say, nonpartisan or independent legal expert says there is no such thing in Israel as not abiding by a Supreme Court decision. It is the highest court in the land. As people were saying, both left-wingers and right-wingers across the political spectrum, if you don't abide by a Supreme Court decision, especially if you're in government, then it's anarchy. It's anarchy. And one senior Likud minister, Yariv Levin, yesterday, almost dared the Supreme Court justices to send the Supreme Court guard to come and physically open the Knesset. Now, if we were talking about the coronavirus and the pandemic and the lockdown here, politically and economically, then these are really uncharted legal waters, even for Israel, even for Israeli politics. Now, I should back up a little bit and say, how did we get here? Just a quick kind of context recap for everyone listening. Israel has been in this kind of political impasse now for a year. We've had 3 elections, last April, last September, and most recently in early March. All of them were inconclusive. Netanyahu wasn't able to obtain a majority. His chief rival, Benny Gantz from the Blue and White Party, also wasn't able to clear a path for himself to form a government, and we can get into the reasons for that later on. But what we have is a political impasse compounded by an incumbent prime minister facing trial on various corruption charges, which has both a legal and a political dimension to it, but primarily political because there is a vast and a one-seat majority, shall we say, or at least half the country is very against Netanyahu continuing as prime minister. That is really the sticking point that has been the sticking point for the past year. And then another half of the country thinks that Netanyahu, not only should he continue, but he's arguably the best prime minister Israel has ever had. So how you bridge that divide is really the difficulty at the moment. Has really been the story of the past year in Israeli politics. As one person who I spoke to recently said, everyone talks about a 2-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here in Israel, politically, there is a 2-state solution, or quote unquote non-solution. It's yes Bibi and no Bibi. It's Bibi Stan and not Bibi Stan. And that really is a divide, again, not not unique to Israel, I would say. There are probably a few other countries in the world who are also deeply divided politically. But the problem here is that the system is a parliamentary system, and just the numbers and the math haven't allowed the Netanyahu opposition, or quite frankly, Netanyahu himself, to actually cobble together a proper government. So Netanyahu, for the past year, has been a caretaker prime minister at the helm of a transition government now 3 times over. So that's just by way of context. There was an election on parliamentary majority for the anti-Netanyahu forces led by the Blue and White Party. Just to make it easier, it's a 61, they hold 61 seats. Netanyahu holds 58, 59 seats, depending on who's counting. So the margins are very fine. They're very fine, and that also complicates issues politically. But the real problem coming out of the election was that Netanyahu didn't have a clear path himself to form a government. He didn't have a parliamentary majority. That is clear, despite his victory speech. And I was there on election night at Likud party headquarters. He called it his greatest victory, the greatest victory of his political career. That was a bit premature. He thought he did it slightly better. He thought he was a lot closer to getting a 61 seat parliamentary majority, but that didn't happen. So he doesn't have a clear path to a government, but neither does Benny Gantz, the head of Blue and White, his chief rival. So Benny Gantz and Netanyahu are kind of circling themselves at the moment, trying to, there are unity talks. There are talks going on behind the scenes to form a national unity government, what Netanyahu has come to call a national emergency government due to the corona crisis, and I'll get to that in a second. So in parallel to these unity talks, which is really the only realistic path, I think, for either one to form a government, you also have Blue and White, and this goes back to the constitutional crisis and the speaker issue and the Supreme Court issue. Blue and White is trying to press ahead its advantage, its parliamentary advantage in the Knesset. And what that means in practice is that it's taking, first of all, Benny Gantz last week got the mandate, as it's called here, the first option to form a government from President Rivlin. That allowed Gantz to take control of various Knesset committees, to form them, to hold a majority on some of them. And then finally, Blue and White intend to replace the Knesset speaker with somebody from their own party. And that has wide-ranging implications for parliamentary procedure, what bills are proposed, what votes are allowed. And that really is a genesis for the current speaker's refusal to vacate. It's the genesis of Netanyahu's insistence that this be a major issue, a major sticking point. And he's threatened to cut off unity talk. And perhaps most ominously, it's taking Israel to the brink constitutionally, because not abiding by a Supreme Court decision is just unheard of, especially again by the government, by the authorities. And so Edelstein has until tomorrow to comply. He hasn't said anything today, but hopefully he comes around and allows the vote on replacing him as speaker. And then Blue and White will actually move forward with various pieces of legislation. We can get into that later on, but that's the plan. That's the state of play politically here in Israel.
Thank you. Neri, we have several questions having to do with cooperation between Israel, the PA, and in some cases Hamas. So I'm just going to present them all to you. Leon Weintraub, what is the state of coronavirus cooperation between the government of Israel, the PA, and Hamas? Then our own Michael Koplow wants you to talk about the status of Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation during the coronavirus crisis and whether it is spurring greater cooperation generally between the two sides or both sides are fending for themselves. And then finally, because I think this is also related, Harry Reese wants to know, what are you hearing about how Israel is expected to deal with the inevitable explosion of COVID-19 in Gaza? What does assistance in Gaza look like? So we're talking about coronavirus health cooperation and security cooperation, particularly between the PA and Israel.
All right, great questions all from some great folk. So I'll start at the top. I would argue, and I wrote this in an article that came out this past weekend, the only silver lining currently here is precisely the closer cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians to combat the outbreak. So if there is a silver lining about all of this, it's the realization on many sides that that religion and politics aside, we're all in this together, and that if there is an outbreak, again, either in the Palestinian territories or in Israel, it will impact the other and vice versa. So the shared humanity is actually coming to the fore, and I think that's a good thing. Israel, from very early on, as I mentioned, has been very proactive in providing assistance both to the West Bank and Gaza. So what does that look like? They're sending in coronavirus. They're sending in protective equipment for medical staff and others, primarily to the West Bank. They're also holding shared kind of medical staff tutorials between Israeli professionals and Palestinian Authority medical staff and first responders. And they're also, they've set up this kind of joint command center to track and coordinate in real time responses to various outbreaks. And so that writ large is how cooperation is undergoing. In terms of Gaza, it's a bit trickier, but they have sent in, as I said, testing kits. They have sent in greater medical equipment. The interesting thing is that, you know, Israel, because it didn't want the infected either laborers coming from Gaza into Israel or you know, various let's say traders and whatnot coming back into Gaza to infect the Gazan population. And similarly, Bethlehem was the first major hotspot in the West Bank to have a corona outbreak. The Palestinian Authority actually, I don't know if it requested, but in coordination with Israel, there was a full closure instituted on Bethlehem, on the city of Bethlehem, the first time since the Second Intifada that a real closure was instituted around a Palestinian city. Again, the Palestinians are taking this very, very seriously. As I said earlier, the Palestinian Authority has put in the areas of the West Bank that it controls. You know, they stopped any movement between various districts in the West Bank, between the villages and the cities. That obviously requires coordination with Israel. And this gets to Michael's question about security cooperation. It's still robust and ongoing, but having said that, the corona crisis actually has raised certain difficulties in terms of a greater presence of the Palestinian security forces in and around Palestinian cities. So they're actually imposing the closure of Bethlehem. And on the flip side, the IDF is still conducting nighttime raids into various Palestinian cities. They maintain that you can't allow the coronavirus outbreak to provide cover for terrorists to organize and to conduct attacks. And so you have this weird situation where the IDF is going into places like Bethlehem or refugee camps near Bethlehem with protective gear on and actually conducting nighttime arrests. And so that holds the potential of increasing potential friction between IDF forces and PA security forces. And then the final question with regard to a potential outbreak in Gaza, you know, we've asked this question multiple times. Various authorities here and security officials. Nobody wants to put it out there because nobody wants to actually at least initially, coronavirus tests were actually sent back from Gaza into Israel for actual testing. Now they're doing it in the Gaza Strip, but you know, there are various possibilities about how an outbreak in Gaza would be handled and would be aided by Israel, stemming from you know, removing or extricating infected patients to Israel for quarantine. up to and including potentially, doing it on a mass scale, putting together in southern Israel either field hospitals or just large structures, gymnasiums, what have you, to house and care for infected from Gaza, to get them out of the Gaza Strip, which, as you all know, is one of the more mostly populated areas in the world. So an outbreak in Gaza could potentially spread very easily.
Before we leave Gaza, Alexander is asking, and you may have touched on this, Neri, but just to be clear, does this cooperation, equipment, staff, tutorials, etc., also take place between Israel and Hamas?
Not to my knowledge, not directly, but this is under normal circumstances. You do have Israel facilitating the entry of medical teams, international medical teams, staff, medical equipment and aid. So that is still ongoing. That is increasing and geared to combat the coronavirus. Several Arab states have given additional funds to help them through this. And the good thing is that the Hamas authorities also seem to be taking this quite seriously. They set up quarantine areas on their southern border with Egypt already for about a week or two. So in theory, they're quarantining people who come in. They're testing people, everything you're supposed to be doing to at least hold off or contain an outbreak.
I'm going to move to blue-white because we have a number of related questions on Kahol Lavan. Dan Rotem wants you to elaborate on the dynamics within blue-white vis-a-vis the formation of the government, Gantz, Lapid, Ya'alon, Ashkenazi, and Hendel Hauser. And then Jonathan Molino wanted to know if Gantz has any options for dealing with Hendel and Hauser. And finally, Evelyn Kenvin, hi Evelyn, is asking, how does the joint list fit into any actions that blue and white has taken or will take?
So I didn't catch the tail end of the last question.
Okay, so the last question had to do with the joint list. How does the joint list fit into blue and white's actions, either that they've taken or that they will take?
Okay, so all those questions are well taken and they're related. So I'll tackle them all together. What I spared the listeners from is to delve too deeply into the idea of a blue and white led, Benny Gantz led minority government. So coming out of the election, at least in terms of the numbers, there was a possibility for blue and white, for Benny Gantz to form a minority government with the external parliamentary support of the joint Arab list. What that actually means in practice is that a minority government, by definition, would be less than 61. So to seat a government in Israel, you don't need an absolute 61 seat majority. You just need a simple majority. Basically, all they needed was one more seat than Bibi. And if Bibi had, let's say, 58 or 59, again, depending on how you count it, then blue and white would only have needed 59 or 60 to actually seat a government. Now, in terms of the numbers, how do you make that happen? You would need the joint Arab list to vote on your behalf twice. First time to seat a government, and then the second time to pass a budget down the line. By law in Israel, the government has to pass a budget, or it falls. A minority government led by Benny Gantz replace the current Netanyahu transitional government. The short answer is that two blue and white backbenchers, the question alluded to Tzvi Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, they're refusing to support it. And they've essentially come out and said that, despite the fact that this would, number one, replace Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister, which was the whole reason for being of blue and white. And number two, it would put blue and white in power. Now, small tangent, a minority government would only really consist of blue and white and possibly the Labor Merits Alliance, maybe even Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu faction. But all told, you might have a government consisting of 40 Knesset members. And for a variety of reasons, that could hold, that could function. The real sticking point isn't the idea of a minority government for Mr. Hindel and Mr. Hauser. It's the idea of a minority government supported by Arab-Israeli votes. And that really is a sticking point for them. Both of them are former aides to Bibi Netanyahu. Both of them are I think, on a deep ideological level, committed right-wingers. I think that's fair to say. They just happen to disagree with Bibi Netanyahu, and that's the reason why they found themselves in blue and white and not, say, in Likud. So it's a real ideological sticking point for them, and they're refusing to support this issue. And without them, Benny Gantz just doesn't have the numbers to even go for this minority government option. Now, in terms of the internal dynamics within blue and white, I'll put it very very delicately. There are disagreements at the top about what the best course of action should be moving forward. So there are more kind of hardline elements, if we can call them that, who simply don't believe Bibi Netanyahu, who don't believe that he'll abide by any unity agreement that they may reach, and that fundamentally he is, as we've seen over the past week, and as blue and white have said consistently, he's undermining the tenets of Israeli democracy. Now, on the flip side, you have, let's say, the more pragmatic wing of the blue and white leadership, who looks at their options, and none of them are very good. If you don't have the minority government option, then what are you really left with? You're either left with a unity government option with Bibi, and the details are being negotiated, and they are important, or you have the perhaps worst option of a fourth election. Now, Israel has already gone through 3 elections. The last election was, even by Israeli standards, arguably the worst of the lot. Blue and white didn't run a very effective campaign. Benny Gantz himself, I think even supporters of his would say that he perhaps regressed as a candidate for prime minister. And more to the point, Netanyahu actually increased his strength during this past election campaign. So going into a fourth election, you're actually gambling that Netanyahu, you're taking the risk of Netanyahu actually getting to a 61-seat majority. So the fourth election option isn't great unto itself.
Okay, Neri, you've frozen for a minute.
The promises they made to not sit under Bibi Netanyahu. But
by
again,
the way, how would Israel, under these circumstances, even hold a fourth election? I mean, can everybody, you don't have mail-in or absentee voting the way we do, or do you? Is that an option if it came to that?
I think it would probably have to be delayed till at least sometime in the fall or the end of the year. We can get into the calculations on Netanyahu's end if people are interested, but from his perspective, he remains prime minister if another election is called. He's still the caretaker prime minister. He might fancy his chances in a fourth election whenever they're actually able to be held. And there are other various kind of possibilities of a temporary emergency government being seated with the support of at least part of blue and white. But really what you're looking at is a very difficult decision for Benny Gantz and his political partners, because it could, you're not only violating the core promise that you gave to your voters, and again, the coronavirus actually provides them a ladder to climb down from that, and provides some political cover for the greater good. This is a time for national unity. We're going to do everything to support the government, and this is why I'm going into the government. I think he could sell it to at least part of the blue and white electorate. Other parts of the electorate would not be as forgiving, shall we say. I will say that they're fully intending to see out the takeover of the Knesset. So the speaker, replacing the speaker, is only one part of it. They've now convened or trying to convene several committees which they control. After that is over, after the takeover of the Knesset is finished, then you might see an actual deal being struck. But Netanyahu has made it more difficult for them over the past week, because he's actually increased the flames and increased the rhetoric, against them for what they're doing. and also in terms of just the democratic process. So it becomes even more unpalatable for the blue and white electorate and for various figures within blue and white to actually consider cutting a deal with Netanyahu, at this time. But that might change in a week.
Before we move on to some other questions, Neri, wonder if you could just talk for a minute about the response of the Israeli public to the hostile takeover from within. I'm thinking specifically the fact that Darkenu organized a virtual protest, and I believe I saw that 600,000 Israelis participated, which would have filled Rabin Square 5 times over. Could you talk a little bit about the ongoing protests and whether or not that's having any kind of effect?
I think I wouldn't go so far as to say it's having an effect. I think it is quite important and impressive to see people come out of general emergency, either driving up themselves to the Knesset and protesting in person, or as you mentioned, holding these virtual demonstrations. I think it's a genuine sentiment. That sentiment, by the way, was there weeks ago. It was there a year ago when blue and white first started, and when the opposition to Netanyahu really started coalescing. So that's in and of itself nothing new. It's been kind of heightened due to Netanyahu's own behavior and own rhetoric over the past several months. So again, that's also nothing new. I should say that precisely because, and this is where the political crisis and the Corona crisis actually come full circle. At a certain point, the Israeli public will perhaps demand a crisis, precisely because of the national emergency, precisely because of the fact that you need a functioning government to increase spending, take care of all the unemployed. You need almost a united front, similar to wartime. And so I could see that sentiment growing as well. Just anecdotally, several Israeli friends of mine who actually voted blue and white and who are no fans of Netanyahu himself, over the past week or so said, look, this is, our distaste for Netanyahu aside, the politics is a sideshow, and this is a real national and global emergency, and these people need to come together and strike a deal. My own sense is that will kind of that sentiment will only grow. I don't think it's gonna decrease as the numbers of infected grow higher, and as restrictions on movement increase, and as the economy goes further down.
So Dan Hammerman's question is related. How willing is Likud to remove Bibi from his post in order to form a government and cease the election cycle?
There is zero interest either within the Likud or among Netanyahu's right-wing allies to see him go. If there was a possibility, that was last fall, after the second election, where Netanyahu actually did worse, and blue and white did much better. So in an ironic twist, blue and white had much better numbers to form a minority government in September, much greater to make that move in coming out of the September election. There are a variety of reasons why that didn't happen, but that was really perhaps their best shot. Netanyahu was challenged. So the rebirth of Netanyahu, politically, I would say, started in December when a challenger from within Likud, Gidon Sar, a former interior minister, challenged Netanyahu for the leadership of Likud. And they actually held a snap Likud leadership vote, and Netanyahu won overwhelmingly. So that reinforced the mandate he had for leadership of Likud. That at least showed the right-wing, his right-wing allies that he to the present moment, Netanyahu actually at least believes that his political strength is only increasing, and that there's a good chance that he might force a breakup within blue and white. And so his right-wing partners, I think, see that as well. They've been the politics for quite some time. So there's no interest whatsoever to replace Netanyahu as prime minister. And by the way, this is an argument you hear not only from kind of Netanyahu diehards or right-wing Israelis. It is a time of legitimate crisis. Netanyahu might be fanning the flames and using it for his own political purposes, but he is a very experienced prime minister and leader, and the notion of replacing him midstream frightens a lot of people, and I don't think that can be understated either.
A slightly related question from M. Sayre. I'm not supporting Gantz, but it may be a mistaken political calculation joining a unity government when Bibi is the first to run it for the first 2 years. And then our questioner says, Bibi will almost for sure dissolve the government at the first moment he will see that new elections will be beneficial.
Yeah.
What's your response?
Therein lies the rub. This is a very difficult decision for Benny Gantz and Blue and White. I don't envy them at all. You have people, I know this for a fact, you have people in Blue and White who are telling Benny Gantz, Bibi isn't going to uphold, he's going to use it for whatever it's worth and for however long he deems it useful, and then he's going to create a crisis, and then he'll go to an election on more favorable terms. Now, those of us and those of you who have been following Israeli politics for some time likely remember that there used to be a major centrist political party in Israel called Kadima. This was created by Ariel Sharon. Tzipi Livni headed it for a number of years, and then Shaul Mofaz, a former IDF chief of staff and defense minister, became the head of Kadima. And they were actually one of the, I think, if not larger than Likud, then right neck and neck with Likud in 2012. And as sometimes happens here, almost overnight, we got word that there was a press conference between Bibi and Shaul Mofaz in the early summer of 2012, and they cut a unity deal. And they cut a deal, a coalition agreement, and Kadima went into the Netanyahu government. I think Netanyahu had then 78, perhaps almost 80 seats in parliament. This was the time that Time magazine ran its famous King Bibi cover. He really could have done anything he wanted. He could have resolved the Palestinian issue, passing whatever legislation he needed. He could have resolved the ultra-Orthodox issue. He had ample cover in parliament to pass whatever bills he wanted. Netanyahu, I think, upheld this agreement for about 2 months until he dissolved it and called first option for Benny Gantz, also considering the fact that there is a legitimate national emergency going on.
While we're talking about Bibi, Neri, could you talk for a minute about his trial, which of course was supposed to begin on March 17th, was postponed, I believe, for 2 months. There's no crystal ball, but could one outcome of coronavirus be that his trial is postponed indefinitely?
Yeah, I think I don't imagine the situation will with regard to Corona will improve drastically by the end of May. I mean, hopefully it does, but that's the date as of now. So the trial was supposed to start last week. It was pushed to the end of May, again, by kind of government diktat late at night. They shut all the courts, except for the Supreme Court, thankfully. But they shut all the courts. Again, Netanyahu, as he has done for at least for the last several months, he's playing for time. And so he thinks that time is working in his favor. In terms of the trial, it may start in May, it may not, but even if it does, it will drag on for, I think, at least a year. So in the meantime, he's maneuvering politically to perhaps extricate himself from the legal position. Corona came down from above indefinitely, let's say.
Stephen M. Lev Cohen wants to know, are we seeing a shift in the depth and extent of opposition to cooperating with Palestinian or Arab Israelis, be it because of the political configuration or because of the coronavirus challenge?
I think, that is a silver lining to the political impasse at the moment. The fact that not only did the Joint Arab List, so it's a alliance of four predominantly Arab Israeli political parties who joined forces again. I'll say a few things. Number one, they increased their strength this last election. Number two, because of this increase in strength and the more voters that they got out, primarily from blue and white, the slight majority that they did achieve. So really, if you're against Netanyahu, you should thank Arab Israelis for coming out, as Netanyahu himself put it, in droves several years ago, because that really arguably was the difference between Netanyahu getting 61 and not. And then number three, the countenance by at least major parts of blue and white to actually work politically with the Joint Arab List. Not only is it coming from blue and white, but we should also say that the Arab Israeli politicians themselves are attenuating their own kind of public demeanor and their own political positions. And the best example of this is last week, the most, let's say, extreme or radical faction within the Joint Arab List actually nominated or recommended Benny Gantz to the president to be prime minister. Now, the notion even just a year ago that this faction would recommend a former IDF chief of staff to be prime minister would have been laughable. And we don't even have to go back a year. Even in September, they refused to actually recommend Benny Gantz to be president. So I think there's a growing appreciation on both sides that a lot of good can be done. It's unfortunate, I say this both as an observer and personally, it's unfortunate the rhetoric we're seeing coming from the very top of the Netanyahu government, including the prime minister, delegitimizing 20% of the Israeli citizenry. So if you take the votes you can't argue that you're the only democracy in the Middle East, and then come back and say that the votes of 20% of your citizenry don't count because you don't like their representatives, who, by the way, were allowed to run legally by both the Central Election Committee and the Supreme Court. You don't have to agree with their politics to confirm the fact that they are legally allowed to run and participate in the democratic process, and their votes should be counted.
Richard Solomon, hi Richard, wants to know, unlike in this country, meaning the United States, does science drive COVID-19 policy in Israel?
Sorry, Susan, I didn't catch that.
Unlike in the US, according to our questioner, Richard Solomon of Chicago, unlike in our country, does science drive COVID-19 policy in Israel, coronavirus policy?
Yes, very much. And to Netanyahu's credit, he took it very seriously very early. They were following guidelines or kind of preemptive measures earlier than most, as I mentioned, and now they're considering a full lockdown and forcible lockdown, precisely because the science dictates that you have to kind of stop everything and distance everyone from each other in order to at least get a grip on the pandemic. There are arguments, this being Israel, there are already arguments between the various players, whether it's the health ministry or the defense ministry, or various kind of pundits and journalists and former health experts about what the best course of action should be, especially given the real economic damage that a shutdown causes. But there's no real division with regard to the severity of the situation and the realness of the threat.
Neri, as you know, in this country, there are severe shortages of necessary equipment, masks, respirators, what they call PPE, personal protective equipment for our healthcare workers, doctors and nurses. Is that an issue in Israel, or do you feel like there's adequate everything?
No, it is definitely an issue. That's one of the internal debates that are going on, whether the health ministry, whether the health system was properly funded and equipped prior to the outbreak, whether there's enough protective gear and masks and whatnot for the medical staff. It's an ongoing debate, like it is in many other places. Arguably, more should have been done. More can be done at the moment. But Israel is already running about 3,000 tests a day as of this week. There was a major argument last week about why aren't they testing more. So they're slowly kind of ramping up, hoping to get to 5,000 by next week. And so I think, like everything in Israel, there might be friction until you get to a proper decision. But once there's a decision, then the system, the various kind of parts of the system do come together and try to kind of unify efforts. It also helps that unlike America, it's a small country. There's one national government, there's one national health system. So it really is, again, almost, you do see criticism about how Netanyahu has kind of taken all the decision-making with regard to the corona crisis unto himself and a small group of health ministry officials. But again, I think that's more a quibble than bigger picture strategy, because I think overall, compared to other Western states, Israel is thankfully ahead of the game. So
Neri, we're approaching the top of the hour, and first of all, I want to say thank you again. And we will certainly want to have you participate in more webinars as this goes forward. I just want to give you an opportunity to share some closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts? Well, I think it's interesting that this kind of long-running political impasse has now melded with this genuine national emergency, global pandemic, to form this weird mix of both legitimate health crisis and, depending on who you ask, legitimate political crisis. And having said that, I think there's a greater possibility than not that Netanyahu will be saved by this legitimate national emergency. In other words, it's an interesting hypothetical to run. What the politics would be if there was no coronavirus outbreak, and what the calculations would be on either side. It's a theoretical at this point. But I think there's a greater chance than not that ultimately Benny Gantz cuts the deal with Netanyahu. Netanyahu continues on as prime minister, at least for the first year and a half, or however long they agreed to have this unity government last for. And so, I don't want to call it ironic, but it almost took a global pandemic to actually extricate Israel from a political impasse and actually potentially save Netanyahu's political career. So that is my closing remark. But again, things are fluid, so tomorrow might change. But that's, to the best of my understanding, the state of play at the moment.
Neri, thank you again very much. And I really, once more, want to thank everyone for participating today. Just a reminder, we are going to be doing this webinar every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe I can say that we have Tammy Wittes of Brookings next Tuesday, and we know Tammy well. She's just a superb analyst and expert. So thank you, everybody. And Neri, tishmor al atzmecha.
Thank you, Susie. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all.